Hello, can you guys hear me? Hi everybody, my name is Sara Daqiq and I am a developer support engineer at Okta. I'm going to be talking to you guys about OAuth and OIDC and how it works, how we use it in our day-to-day life. So let's just jump in and look at our agenda for today. See how this works. Okay. So first of all, we are going to define what the problem is, what is the problem that we are trying to solve, and then we are going to look at how people used to solve this problem before. We are going to look at OAuth 1 and then OAuth 2, and then we are going to look at what JSON Web Token or JWTs are. At the end, we are going to have and talk about OpenID Connect, and then I'm going to open floor for discussion on and Q&A. So let's jump in and see what the problem we are trying to solve. How do we securely share our information between two or more parties? So that's the question that we have defined and we are trying to solve. So if I have my information with Google, I want to try to share that information to Yelp. How do I securely do that? So in the old days, what they would do is they would just give the other person your password. So in this case, this is a screenshot of Yelp in 2007. What they would do is, Yelp is asking for your email address. They are also asking for specifically for your Gmail password. So what they would do is they would sign in Gmail as you. And then they would go crawl through your contacts and then email your friends and saying, oh, have you heard about Yelp? But they would be as you. So your friend thinks, oh, this is my friend Peter here. They are asking me about Yelp, right? So obviously, this wasn't a good solution. As you can imagine, there were many problems with it, but a few of them would include that the third-party application, usually Yelp, for example, in this case, I don't know if they did it, but the third-party application usually store your password in plain sight. That's not a good idea. They would have full access to your account, so what that meant is that they could do whatever you could do in your account. The last thing that they could do is that they could just change your password, and in that case, revoking your access to your own data. That wasn't a good solution, so people came up with, and there were like identity use cases. What that means is that at that time, there were few problems about identity that wasn't solved before, and it still is the case, but these were the problems that we were trying to solve. For example, if you wanted to log in the user, you would just use a form. If you wanted to single sign-on, you would use SAML. I'm not going to go over what SAML is, but it's a protocol that you would use. It's somehow correlated to OIDC. Mobile app, it didn't have any authentication protocol. Does anybody know why that is? In 2007, how many applications were there in App Store? 100? Right, yeah, 0. So because the Apple iPhone or smartphone got released in 2007, it was a couple of months at the end of 2007. What happened was that the App Store at that time only allowed their own apps. So third-party application couldn't get it. That's why the jailbreaks and all that, right? So the third-party application couldn't sign into Apple Store. So that's why if there wasn't any problem, then there wasn't any solution, right? And then the last thing was the delegated authorization, which I'm going to cover in the slides as well. The one thing that I want to make sure I communicate is that by the end of this presentation, I want to have 3 questions answered. One of them is that what is OAuth? The other question is what is OIDC or OpenID Connect? And then the last one is what is JWT or JSON Web Token. So let's get back to our problem with sharing sites, right? So sharing information. So people came up with, they were like, okay, sharing my password or sharing user password is not a good idea, so let me see what I can do. They come up with their own solution. For example, Flickr came up with Flickr API that would do authentication. Google came up with their own APIs that would do authentication. And then Yahoo came up with his API or their API to do authentication. The problem with this was that they were completely incompatible with each other. They wouldn't work with each other. They would just work with, so if you're a developer, if you are building an application, you would have to build different authentication system to match each of these criteria. That was a problem. The other problem was that most of the time it failed to address some issues, like security issues. One of them would lack in some certain area, and then the other would lack in the other areas. So there was this guy, his name was Blaine Cook. He was an architect at Twitter. He said, okay, I'm going to kind of combine all of them together and create a open source protocol that we would use. So that's what they did. They all, people from Google, Flickr, and Yahoo, and these other big companies came together, and they created this open standard protocol called OpenID Connect. So OpenID Connect was pretty good. People liked it. You didn't have to share your password, but then it had a lot of problems. It was pretty confusing because basically what you did was you kind of combined different flows together and kind of like forced it together to work together. So it was pretty confusing. Developers were like spending so much time in that. There were a lot of like mobile applications. So this came out, OAuth came out 3 months before Apple's smartphone was released. So there wasn't any solution for mobile application at this time. And then in 2009, there were so many confusion and everything, and so the editor said, okay, let's just throw away OAuth 1, let's build another version, call it OAuth 2, and kind of learn from our mistakes from OAuth 1 and do whatever we didn't do well in OAuth 1 in OAuth 2. So they built OAuth 2. When they built OAuth 2, it was pretty good. These are the things that it wasn't present on OAuth 1, and it was kind of like an upgrade on OAuth 2. I want to also mention that OAuth 2 is not backward compatible, so they are different protocols, they're different versions. They're not as, like if you are using OAuth 1, it's not going to be compatible with OAuth 2 or vice versa. So the one thing that OAuth 2 did pretty well was transport dependent. What that means is that when you communicate data between two parties, it depends on HTTPS to securely transfer data. So that the HTTPS protocol, it didn't do that in OAuth 1. The other thing was that, so it's much easier to work with, it's efficient, it's easier, developers don't have to invest a lot of time to work with this. And then the last thing that they did well was that it supports native apps. So with coming of native app, the industry was disturbed. There were so many identity solutions that wasn't unsolved, so this solved them. So let's dive into deep and see what OAuth 2 looks like. So we already covered that HTTPS is the base, right? It transfers data, and that's what OAuth 2 uses. I want to also mention that after this, when I say OAuth, I'm referring to OAuth 2. The other thing that they did was that they added OAuth on top of HTTPS. OAuth is also for authorization. We are going to cover what that is. So at the top of that, you can add JWT or JSON Web Token. You can add OpenID Connect, and you can add Pixie, like that's the mobile authentication where the mobile uses. So what's cool about OAuth is that OAuth is kind of the foundation, and then all these things, all these other things at the top, okay, let's go back. Okay, all these things that are highlighted at the top, they could be mixed and matched. You could just use one of them, you could use two of them together, so they could be mixed and matched together to create a flow. So just so we are clear, the OAuth is the foundation, and then you can mix and match and use all of them together or separately. So we're going to go back and focus on OAuth 1 or OAuth 2. So OAuth 2 is perfect, but every OAuth has a problem, or every authentication system at some point has a problem. So since the beginning or inception of OAuth 1, there's two huge communities that are kind of fighting together, and they're like, I want it this way, and the other one is like, I want it this way. So one of them was, the two communities that are in here is web community, web development community, and also enterprise community. So they have been fighting since, that's why it has been like so much confusion and so much iterations, right? So they couldn't agree on certain criteria of how OAuth should look like. So these conflicts came to be when OAuth 2 came to inception. They created their own documentation, so they couldn't agree. So they created their own documentation on RFCs, and that resulted on many RFCs. So now, if you are trying to implement OAuth 2, you are going to have to go to different sources to collect the information, and that's a source of confusion as well. So there are many RFCs just for OAuth 2. The other thing that was happening, that since there was so many confliction and nobody could agree, they renamed it as, instead of protocol, to be framework. And they already have an RFC that says, okay, security concerns of OAuth 1 or OAuth 2. So that means is that like there are security concerns with this. It's not that it's like complete secure. I was talking with Martin just a couple of minutes ago, and he told me about this security flaws that happened on Facebook. So what happened was that I'm going to talk to you guys about what access token is, but when you say view as, and in Facebook, and you're like looking at somebody else, of how your profile looks at somebody else, there was a security flaw there. I've been reading up on it, but that has been like 2 minutes, so I don't have much information about this, but I know what they are talking about, that there are still security flaws with OAuth 2. My point here is that. So let's look at a real world example of how this scenario plays, right? So let's say I'm a hotel manager, and I want to grant access to the handyman, and the handyman is going to go, so he has the access. So the handyman is going to go to obtain the key from the receptionist, right? And then, so the handyman can go clean some of the hotels that are not, like the people left, like, and it's not clean, so the handyman goes cleans that. As you can see, I grant or delegated access to handyman, and handyman goes on behalf of me, gets the key from the receptionist, and then handyman goes and cleans the room on my behalf, okay? So if we translate it to an app example, this is how it looks like. So the user delegates access to, let's say, Yelp. Yelp goes ask for access on my behalf from, let's say, Google. And then, so, well, let's say Yelp has this feature that's called reserve, and then when you reserve it, it's gonna, I want Yelp to automatically book that time in my calendar. So Yelp can go and book the time in my calendar. The cool thing about this is that if I don't want Yelp to read my data in my calendar and see what I've been doing, the only thing that I could do is just say write access. This Yelp only have write access, not read access. Okay, so in real world example, this is how it looks like. When I open up Yelp and I try to sign in, it gives me a couple of options, right? One of them is to sign in with Facebook. One of them is to sign in with Google. The other one is to just enter my data. So basically, the whole presentation, what it does is what goes on behind that sign up with Google scenario. That's what we are going to cover. So the whole presentation is about what's going on behind that scenario, all right? So in this case, I'm saying that I trust my Gmail, it has my data, and then I want to give my data from my Gmail account to Yelp account instead of creating new data source, right? Excuse me. So let's look at the code. So when I click and sign up with Google, what happens, right? When I click with sign in with Google, and then I say, okay, you go ask Gmail, I'm asking Yelp to go ask Gmail for my profile and contact information. Okay, so now I'm gonna sign in to Gmail with my username and password. But as you can see, this is not inside Yelp, it's inside, I'm giving my information to Google. So once I do that, Yelp is like, hey, there is this person asking information about you. Would you like to give it to him? I'll be like, yeah. So when I say that, then I have the Yelp or Google sends a key to Yelp. Now, so it's redirected to Yelp again. And then Yelp can use that key to access my contact. So that's the architecture. But one thing that I want to make sure that we kind of notice for the future reference is that as in here, this person Yelp does not know who requested at the beginning. He doesn't know. So the key that's being sent, it doesn't have any user information, and we will cover that what that means later. So let's look at the button that we saw is just a GET request, right? It's a URL GET request. So let's create that. We are going to have a URL that goes to Google, and then we are going to have a client ID. This client ID is configured at Google, and then we are going to have redirect URL because once we collect the information, we want to know where to go back. So this is the redirect URL that's going to go back to Yelp, and then we are going to have scope. That's like the information that they have access to, and then we are going to have token, or responsive token, what we are requesting is, oh, okay, what's the type of response that I want to get? And then we have state. State is kind of like a security measurement that you would take. You want to send the same data as you would get back. So it's just a security protocol that we would need to do. So one thing that we need to also focus is the scope and content. These are the things that are going to change in the future. So the scope is contacts and profile, right? I want to have access to this person's contact and this person's profile. And response service token, I want to have a key. So before we look at what, yes? Oh, client ID is the name of ID that you have configured at Google, in Google. At the beginning, you have to configure something that like the developer who created that button. Right? Yeah, Yelp has to do that. Yeah, Yelp has to configure that. Yeah. So before I look at the response of this, I'm going to jump a little bit and go and look at what JWT looks like. Once I cover that, I'm going to come back and see what the response looks like. Yes? Yeah, so that's SAML is another protocol that you could use. I talked about at the beginning that you could use. It's kind of like in parallel with OpenID Connect. I would like to not cover that at this presentation, but that's a parallel thing that you can use to do single sign-on. Can we hold on to questions after you done at the end? Is that okay? Go ahead. You go ahead, but then after that we will. I can ask questions or answer questions at the end if that's okay. Yeah. So state is, I think it's called CRF attack. What happens is that if you have the state value here, when you authenticate the token, the response, you have to have the same state value. So it makes sure that you have like it's an extra security protocol. You have to have the same state token that's returned by the response. All right. So okay. So what is JWT? We kind of like, after we got the GET request, we kind of paused the GET request and we are looking at the JWT now. So JWT stands for JSON Web Token. It is basically a self-contained JSON object. So what that means is that it has everything you need. It's just a JSON object, but it has everything that you need to verify that it's trusted. It's this digitally signed, so you trust the author, and then you can encrypt it. So in our case, we are going to encrypt it, but it doesn't have to be encrypted. This is how it looks like, the structure. There is a header. The header usually is telling you what kind of signature are they using, and then you have payload, that's the data that you're going to have, and then the signature. The signature is the digitally signed information that you would verify that data from. So let's go back to our OAuth and see how our OAuth response looks like. So we're back to OAuth. We went to JSON Web Token, covered that, and we're back to OAuth. So when I get the response, my response is going to look like something like this. The first part is the header. It's going to have, once I decode it, obviously, it's going to have the data for my what signature I've been using, or what algorithm that I've been using to encode this. It has the payload. All the information that I need is in the payload, or the information that I requested. And then it has a signature. So the signature is going to say, okay, I approve this information or not. That's the information, or the signature is going to be useful for that. When I decode this OAuth token, this is what I'm going to get. So OAuth token or OAuth 2 response is called access token. So when I decode that, this is what I'm going to get. It says some information about the issuer, the subject, and all this information. But and then it says scope, contact, profile. As you can see here, there's no information about the user. So this is when the Yelp gets the key, this is a token that they get. But there's no information about the user here. It says, okay, whoever has the key, give this the contact and profile of that user to give them access to contact and profile. Okay, so now we have covered OAuth 2. Now let's go to OpenID Connect and see what OpenID Connect looks like. So OpenID Connect is built on top of OAuth, so it's going to be very similar flow, actually the same flow. So we are going to have to, when I say connect with Google, I'm going to request for profile and contact, and then it's going to go to Google. You add your username and password. Google is going to say, hey, this person is requesting for information. And I'm going to say yes, okay, give them the information they're requesting. They're going to come back, and in this case, you can see it has my information. It knows who I am. It says, hello, Sara, right? And then I have the user information, but I also got the access token, so I can go to the backend and say, hey, I have access to contacts. Give me the contact information or the user information. So how is it different than the previous one? The only difference is that it has user information in it, and that's called OpenID, and OAuth is, the difference is that OpenID is on top of OAuth, and it's the identity layer. It sends user identity. So in this case, it has Sara. So if I look at, so yeah, we covered that. So in here, this right now, all the errors that you see, it's access token, right? It has all the information about the key. But then these two parts makes it an ID token because it has the user information in here. The user information, you know who that user who was accessing information is. So let's go and find out how to create this OpenID request. It's the same thing as previous ones. You will have a URL to Google Auth, and then you will have the client ID, and then you will have the redirect URL. Once everything is done, where do you want to redirect it? And then you have the scope, let's say contact and profile. You can create your own scopes as well, and then you can create claims that would attach to those scopes. You can have open a response type ID token in this case. So the previous request, the only difference is that in previous request it was token. In this request it's ID token, and then you have state at the same time. So the only difference in here right now is that with OAuth you're requesting access token or token or the response type. In this case you're asking for ID token. When I do the response, this is how it's going to look like. So it's still the JWT, right? We covered that the response of OpenID Connect and OIDC is in JWT or JSON Web Token. This is basics for encoded, so it's header. We have header, we have payload, we have signature, and then signature approves the data. When I decode it, this is what I'm going to get. So I have everything that access token has, but then I have more about user information, right? So my user, this is the information about the user that I wouldn't have if I had OAuth. So the difference between access token or ID token, or the difference in one case, the difference between OpenID Connect response and OAuth response is that in OpenID Connect response, you will get the user information. So we only covered one flow. There are other flows. So what we covered is called implicit flow. It's used for single page application. We have other flows. One of them is called authorization code flow, which we can use for server side. We have authorization code flow with Pixie, which we can use for mobile application. You can have resource owner flow. This is very much like giving out your password. So it's only for trusted servers or your own servers specifically that you trust. And then you have client credential flow, which is server-to-server application. So authorization code flow is supposed to be the safest one, and also authorization code flow with Pixie. Okay, so once we cover this, let's go to and say, okay, what's so unique about this, right? It's the lifetime of the token. Whenever you want, if you see that your token is compromised, what you can do is that you can revoke access. You can also extend the lifetime. With the refresh token, you can request a refresh token and extend the lifetime of the access token. Refresh token could have an unlimited lifetime. So if you would like, you want to give them somebody an unlimited access, you can just give them a refresh token that they can refresh each time. And the last thing that they could do is that a separation of rules. So there is a clear distinction between authorization and authentication that we covered. Okay, so identity use case for today looks like this. You're using for login, you can use OIDC or OpenID Connect. For single sign-on, you can use OIDC and OpenID Connect. For mobile application, you can use OIDC and OpenID Connect. And then for delegated authorization, you can use OAuth. So the answer to the questions that we had before, remember we had a question at the beginning of the presentation, would be that What is OAuth? So OAuth delegates authorization to another site, or you get the response for the response would be access token. What is OIDC? OIDC is the identity layer on top of OAuth, and it is for authentication, and the response would be ID token. And what is JWT? JWT is the way that you would create the access token and ID token. So the format of the data is called JSON Web Token, or JWT. The resources I used for this thing, for this presentation, was that I used OAuth 2 Simplified by Aaron Oraki. I used OIDC, OAuth and OIDC in plain English by Nate Barbettini. I highly recommend that. It's a video. I used OAuth 2 Playground by Google. So, okay, now I'm opening the floor for questions.